A little intro to Mary. Born in New Haven, Connecticut, Mary is a photographic artist living and working in Roanoke, Virginia, who utilizes traditional and experimental analog photographic methods to investigate land, home, and environment. Her recent cameraless photographic work explores the delicate and resilient nature of film emulsion exposed to environmental conditions. Where she collaborates with light and weather and time to create unique photographs that embrace chance, mistake, and deterioration. Mary received her MFA in Visual Arts from Lesley University College of Art and Design and a BFA in Visual Arts from Northern Vermont University. She was in 2020 the recipient of Vermont Arts Council Creation Grant and support of her new work, her new analog cameraless photographic work. Her work has been exhibited at the Photographic Resource Center outside of Boston, and the Eleanor D. Wilson Museum, and the Griffin Museum of Photography, and Milk Parlor Gallery in Iceland, the Air Gallery in Brooklyn, and recently in a virtual exhibit hosted by Strange Fire Collective and Humble Arts. And from 2004 to 2020, where I first crossed paths with Mary, she ran a public access community darkroom and digital lab in Burlington at Burlington City Arts, or associated with Burlington City Arts, and is currently an assistant professor of photography at Hollins University in Roanoke, which is a historically women's college, where she now resides with her lovely sidekick, Chuck, who will be joining us in the background this evening. So I assuming the mailman doesn't show up, Chuck will be on his best behavior. But thank you, Mary, for, I would say, coming all this way, but for coming all the way to this room that you're in, and for being able to be with us and talk a little bit about your work. And it's been such a pleasure to see people coming in and grappling with your process and your subject and the environmental factors and the critters and plants and flora and fauna that you utilize to create this body of work. So thank you, and I'll let you take it over if you want to say a few introductory things, and then we'll hop into the slideshow of images, and then at the end we'll open it up and we'll have a more of a formal Q&A session. So thank you, Mary.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh, for the introduction. Thank you.
I'll be nearby.
Thank you to everyone who is watching tonight from Vermont, where I hear the weather is really beautiful. So I appreciate you taking the time this evening to be here. So it's really special for me to show this work at the Vermont Center for Photography. I was a photographer and artist for 19 years in Vermont before relocating to Virginia in 2020 to teach at Hollins. So I'm excited to kind of come home and have this talk with all of you. And I'm going to pop right into that right now. So just bear with me for a minute while I get the screen shared. All right. So I'm going to talk tonight about various cameraless projects that I've been doing over the last 10 years, just to give you a sense of how I got into this in the first place and how that kind of has evolved into the kind of work that I do now. And so the first question I often get when I say that I'm doing cameraless photography is like, what? Like, what does that even mean? How can a photograph be created at all without the use of a camera? And so to understand this, we need to understand the meaning of the word to photograph. And so I teach an experimental photography class at Hollins that's all cameraless work. And so this is really how we start our semester, talking about like, what is a photograph? So simply put, to photograph is to draw with light. And so when I think about that, this idea that I can draw with light, that's pretty exciting to me. And so when you start thinking about that in the context of creating photographic imagery, the possibilities for this expanded field of photography become really exciting. I get very excited about this. And so there's a rich tradition within photography's history of creating light-based cameraless photographic prints without that focusing mechanism of the lens. Because of course, all the lens is doing is taking that light and focusing it into an image. So I think many of us know Anna Atkins. Anna Atkins was the first female photographer, published the first photo book, in fact. She was a botanist who used the cyanotype process in the 1800s to create a record of plants and algae. And so, she placed the algae on the surface of the coated paper, exposed it to light, and created images in that way. So in many ways, she is the grandfather of the cameralist, or the grandmother, excuse me, of the cameralist process. So one book that I really enjoy in thinking about kind of this alternative or expanded view of photography is Lyle Rexer's The Edge of Vision. So I'm just going to go ahead and read you this quote. So light is unlocked, received, and revealed as the fundamental penetrating force of the universe, capable of transmogrifying the ordinary, the quotidian, the real, and the known. And so light just has this incredible kind of expansive way of changing our viewpoint. So to transmogrify is to transform in a surprising and magical manner. So to get us started, I'm going to talk about some earlier work where I was using a scanner. I was making kind of this contraption on a flatbed scanner to create some images. So this first series, Negative Positive, I started in 2012, 2013, and was working with the scanner to create these glitches in the software. And so like many things, like most things in my practice, this started with some sort of accident or mistake, and then I ran with it. So in this particular image, this is one of the first images, I created this box of mirrors that I placed over an open scanner, and then I prompted the software to scan. So I was thinking about how do we understand space, and how do we understand space in a more maybe abstract way. So what's interesting to me is that each vertical line in this image is a glitch, actually. It's the scanner software, like trying to understand what's going on and then failing, and trying to understand what's going on and then failing. And so like poetically, this spoke to me too, of this like trying to understand something and maybe failing. So at the same time, I was really thinking about photography as a medium. I was in graduate school, so of course I was doing a lot of research and thinking. So I created this image with different tools we use to see. And so you can see my hand is on the bottom left. I'm holding a right angle prism, which is used in a 35mm camera to write the image so you can compose. And then I had this little hanging prism that I was poking with my fingers. And so movement, I learned, was registered as a horizontal line, and then the glitch of the software was the vertical line. And so kind of playing with how did movement affect this process. I then started placing kind of exposed film into this contraption and playing with that, like losing the image, and was thinking about also the idea of memory, like how do we lose memory over time, or how does it change, right? Memory is very mutable. So to give you a sense of scale, these are these works at the Vandernoot Gallery at Lesley University. So they were printed intentionally at my height, also just thinking about the relationship of the body in space. And they're just large archival pigment prints on dye bond. So when I finished graduate school, I was able to go to Iceland in 2014 and 2015 to attend a residency in Akureyri, which is in the far north, and was thinking about like how can I play with this process using materials that I find in this very unusual geothermal landscape. And so how digital technology intersects with our physical experiences of the landscape became kind of interesting to me as I started this project. So the funny story actually is that I brought a flatbed scanner with me to Iceland, and I actually fried it on the first day I was there by plugging it in incorrectly because the electricity was different. So I did some other work while I was there, but then I brought some of these materials back to my studio in Vermont to kind of play with within this scanner camera that I had made. So these are all just different stones and rocks and sulfur that are kind of in this sort of digital environment, right? And so I started to like this idea of almost looking like it was going backwards and forwards in space. This is another image from that series. I also play with reversing them. So, this is the positive scan. You can see these little diamond-shaped crystals. Those were clear, and then sometimes I would print them as a negative. So this ongoing interest in like what's a negative, what's a positive, I kept playing with as well. I really enjoyed how the color came out in this one, and thinking about this sort of hot sulfuric yellow landscape. And what I'll say about the color is that I can control it somehow, a little bit, depending on the angle of the open scanner and how the mirrors were set up over it. But not really, because it was often random. And so I enjoyed this, but I didn't necessarily get it again. So shortly after those residencies, Burlington City Arts was doing an annual exhibition called Of Land and Local. And that exhibition encouraged artists in the Lake Champlain region to kind of explore the idea of the Vermont landscape, perhaps through an alternative lens. And so when I was invited to do this show, I decided to kind of play with this process that I've been doing. I'll say that I did a lot of fails before I got to the images I'm going to show you, because I tried some new things that didn't work. And I think it's important to talk about that. You know, cameraless process is very personalized, and there's a lot of trial and error as you just try things out and see what sticks and see what works. So when I started with this project, I was, in the water with a handheld scanner. That didn't work, and decided again to bring things to my studio to scan. So this was a magical, lucky, amazing mistake where I got the blue, right? And so this idea of water or floating, this kind of strip of sky above, that was totally, again, an accident that I have not really recreated since. And so I felt like it was sort of a moment of magic with the process. And another image from that series. You can see the movement here. So there's actually water on my scanner, and I'm moving it with my hand to create that feeling of a ripple effect. Yeah, these are things you shouldn't do with your real nice scanner. But so here's something a little bit different. It's a Comcast van hanging out of my former garden bed. So why am I showing this to you in the middle of a talk about cameraless photography? So the day that this van crashed into my property in Grand Isle was sort of a pivotal moment in my practice. And so I just want to tell you a little story that happened here. So when I lived in Vermont, I lived on Route 2 in Grand Isle, so very busy 2-lane highway. And in the morning, I was pulling out of my driveway and heading to work, and I saw this like beautiful, perfectly intact dead squirrel at the end of the driveway that had been hit. And so I was kind of in a hurry, and I saw it and left it there and went to work. And so maybe a half an hour later, I got a call from my partner, and she was panicked. And she's like, van hit the house in the garden, need you to come home. And of course that instilled some panic in my heart, and I drove back home. And there was this van dangling in the garden bed. So it crossed the center line. The person actually had a medical event, they blacked out. And the driver crossed the center line. He went through all of this hedging, all of our fence, clipped, if you look at the right picture, that edge that's the 1875 portion of the house, clipped just the edge, left a little dent in the side of the house, and then kept going downhill into that garden bed. And so, of course, this really freaked me out, right? I thought about all the different ways this could have gone wrong. Had I left a little later, I had a flexible schedule, I could have been hit. If it had veered even a foot over, it would have really destroyed the original part of our house. My partner could have been outside gardening as she tended to do at that time of the day. It just could have gone sideways, right? Like really badly, but it didn't. And so we were lucky. And so that evening, as I was processing all of that, existential feelings, I remembered the squirrel at the end of the driveway. And so I went to check on it, and it had not been hit the second time. So it had bad luck in the morning, but it remained intact at the end of the driveway. And so I decided to start working with its body directly onto paper. And so for a while, I've been looking for a way to bring this kind of cameraless process from the digital world into the physical world. I didn't want to be on the computer all the time. I wanted to be outdoors, and I hadn't quite figured out how I wanted to do that. And so it really started with this kind of the day of the van and the squirrel. So what I did on that first evening is I placed the body on top of some vintage, probably 1970s Agfa warm tone fiber-based paper, and decided each day that I did this, that I would pair the body with a botanical that was sort of in the process of going by. So this was excuse me, this was early summer, and so this was the bleeding part with the body. So the next day, I lifted the squirrel again, and I paired the body with some daffodils, and you can kind of see how this project moves along. Day 3. So days 9 and 10, you know, this is where the body like dissolves, right? So in this process, it's like I'm getting to be witness to something that we don't ordinarily see, and there's this kind of reverence to this process. And so this one was a little difficult to make, but after the body went through that transformation on day 16, this was kind of, we can still see the tail on the left. That's really the anchor point with these pictures, but now we're seeing less of the form of the body. Day 17. This one was interesting to me. What was happening is the insects that were working on the body at this point were kind of moving the squirrel along the paper. And so that's why there's this blur happening here. Day 25. And day 38. So I didn't do this every day. It was sort of depending on what was going on and what have you. But I learned that it takes about this long for a squirrel to decompose in Vermont. You can see the skull in this one, and then this is the final image in the series. So kind of just the bones, which I still have, and a little bit of that fur. So this is what the work looks like installed, just to give you an idea. There wasn't room for these in this exhibition, but this is how they look. They're sort of floated in a wood frame. So at the same time, I was invited to be part of Land and Local again, and this particular year had a theme of the watershed, Lake Champlain watershed. So this is a picture of the Lake Champlain watershed. You know, Grand Isle is up here. That's where I lived. And so, I mean, Lake Champlain is so amazing. I'm guessing if most of you are in Vermont, you've been there. You know, it's a former ocean floor. It's really this almost living being, right? It's very beautiful. So as I was kind of thinking about this idea of watershed, you know, there's the scientific definition of the watershed, but I became really interested in the second definition, which is an event or period marking a turning point and a course of action or state of affairs. And so the squirrel, it was like, what was the watershed moment? It was the car that was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or we all have different watershed moments in our life, whether it be an accident or something changing, or, you know, we have these moments. And so this idea of watershed became something that was percolating in the background. So as I approached this project, I was thinking about the lake and this idea of the lasting memory of water. Like, how does water hold all these different things that flow into it, both physically and sort of energetically, and decided to work with this idea of water within Cameron's process. So this was the point when I started working directly with black and white film. And so each image in this series involved Lake Champlain water, and then something I found either on the shoreline, in the lake, or something that I knew was flowing into the water like a pollutant, right? So I was thinking about that as well. So this is one of the first images I created from that series. You know, it's a plant from Lake Champlain. It was pressed. I got this great detail. It also kind of felt like a spine. And so this got me excited, right, about playing with this process. And this was in 2016, and I'm still playing with this, right? I'm still interested in this. This image was, excuse me, just need a little water. In this image, I was thinking about invasive species. So there was a small wetland that flowed into the place I like to swim in Grand Isle, and this was milfoil and duckweed, which was sort of overtaking that water. This is a fish skeleton. I exposed this during the total eclipse of the sun, which you might remember from that summer, and got kind of a different result than I had normally gotten. And I became interested in this idea of the aerial or the body as a map. This is, you know, I was thinking about, again, what was flowing into the lake and remaining. So this was motor oil and water, and I'm kind of playing with that. So at this juncture, I started thinking about like what would happen if I did color film. And of course, color film is essentially black and white film, but with dye layers. And when you get them wet out of context, those dye layers kind of move around and create kind of colors you wouldn't expect. So I started working with plastic trash that I would find along the lake and exposing that into color film. So as I was wrapping up this particular project, and this particular image is in the exhibition at VCP, I started to become interested in what would happen to the film if it's exposed for long periods of time, or like how can time and weather become written into the film. So this was an image that was left outside through summer rain, and so it felt like the water and the environment was creating the mark. So the mark making was out of my control. It was, from the environment. And so these pieces started to become more collaborative, right, with environment and what the environment would do, thinking somewhat in my mind, in the back of my mind, about Talbot's pencil of nature, right? The idea of how is nature writing this image or creating this image. This is also in the show at VCP, and this was made over 5 months of winter. That's the title of the piece. And so, I just left it to kind of melt and freeze and melt and freeze. And we got these kind of beautiful ice crystal shapes in there. So a little diversion for a minute. So just to get an idea of how I'm thinking as an artist. So while I'm doing that, I'm also still taking pictures. And so through most of this process. And so I shoot almost exclusively, pretty much exclusively with film. I use a Mamiya RB67, which is a medium format camera. And so at the same time, from this moment, maybe 2016 through 2018, I was working on a project called 45 Degrees North. And so while I'm working on cameraless and that way of interpreting the environment, I'm also taking pictures of the Champlain Islands and creating artist books from that material. And so those books were released on the equinoxes and the solstices in 2018, end of 2017 through 2018. And so this idea of how do we experience the landscape, and also what's our psychological reaction to the landscape. And you can see there's some cameraless work kind of on the left side that's kind of peeks into that book. So I'm showing you this little diversion to talk about how this kind of intersects for me. So I remember one day I was home and it was the winter, and my partner texted me and she said, "Beautiful fox, side of Route 2, do you want to go get it?" And that's when you found true love, when your partner is bringing you things like this for your projects. And so we met on the side of the road, and we brought this beautiful fox home that had been hit, let it decompose on our land instead of being blown off Route 2. And so I started working with it in the way that I did with the squirrel in some ways. So photographing it, right? This is a film image that I made at that time. This is kind of a different approach with film. So this is an in-camera multiple exposure of the fox. This is the cover actually of the winter issue of 45 Degrees North. And then this is the cameraless image that came from the body. And so I decided to put film under the body. Some of it sort of blew away into our woods, but to kind of understand what's happening here, the blood is flowing out of the head, and that's making that shape that you see on the right side. You can see the imprint of the fur. So this was exposed for a very long time. And that led to the series Remnants, which really is part of now the greater umbrella of the Lost Garden exhibition that I've been showing here and there. So that particular winter, rural areas are, it's different than being in the city. You interact with wildlife more, and, you find deceased wildlife more. So that was the winter. We had the bomb cyclones in Vermont. It was very, very cold. And so the starlings were falling from the sky, frozen into our driveway. So I was photographing the bird for the book, and then also creating images. So this is the starling's body sort of decomposing into the film. You can see the feathers here and the cracking of the film that's happening. This image is fur from a rabbit that we found, probably eaten by a fox, similar to the earlier fox we saw. This is a byrozoan from Lake Champlain. So this was actually made during Lasting Memory of Water, but it sort of got repurposed or rebrought into this series. This was a beautiful woodpecker that my partner found that had been electrocuted from a power line. And so I exposed it actually twice. We also kept bees, or I can't take any credit for that. My partner keeps bees. And in Vermont, it's hard because they freeze over the winter. So in March of, I believe it was March of 2020, on the spring equinox, we opened the hive and they had not survived. And so I exposed the film through the empty comb that was left in the hive. And at that same time, I was having kind of my own, I had an accident that had kind of led to a health crisis. And so this idea of fragility and change and impermanence was really at the forefront of my mind when I was making this work. And lastly, our weasel friend. This is the only wildlife that we found inside of our house. Our cat had left 2 neat puncture wounds, and I decided to expose it outdoors as well. So moving forward into specifically the Lost Garden series, sort of in the midst of that health crisis that I mentioned, I had lost some abilities that felt really core to my identity. And so I was really kind of evaluating, my studio practice, kind of this idea of the watershed moment, like that had been sort of abstract, became very personal. And at this moment, I wrote and received the grant from the Vermont Arts Council, the Creation Grant. And that grant really changed my trajectory. It really helped me to purchase some larger film and to have some time to work on this project. So I started thinking about, this is 8x10 sheet film as opposed to the 4x5 you've been seeing. I started playing with compositions right on the surface of the film. And so, as I was kind of contemplating my own grief, right, through unexpected change and loss, I was printing in the darkroom, and I remember specifically this moment when this title, The Lost Garden, came to me. And, rather than just my own personal experience, I started thinking about this idea of change in the natural world and like what we might lose, right, in the future if climate change sort of continues going unchecked. And right, that feels like a different thought in 2020 than it does now, where things feel very escalated. But that's what was sort of, I was connecting to this idea of like, what is the lost garden? Like, what do we take for granted that we have around us right now that may not be there in the future? So the materials I was using, they're mostly coming again from our land or from the islands or from our garden. You can see the shape of a sparrow here. The last image was a monarch butterfly. This is a cardinal. You can see its talon here, the head. Exposed that twice. This was during some snow and weather, and so the film was getting very deteriorated. So maybe 2 of my favorite images from this series were the frogs. And so my partner she was at the beach in South Hero in the winter taking a walk, and there were all these dead frogs on the shoreline, and we're unsure why that had happened, but she brought some home, and it was so cold that the frogs just sort of froze into the film, and sort of this otherworldly feeling kind of came from this image for me. And this one in particular felt very human, very vulnerable. So these images that I'm showing you are, they're not digital prints, they're contact printed in the darkroom. So I'm taking this 8x10 negative and printing it directly on Ilford some matte warm tone paper. So moving to Roanoke, I found very quickly that this doesn't quite work in an urban environment. Decaying animals in your apartment garden doesn't necessarily work. I had a mishap with a possum here. So I also realized that so much of my work is about responding to the environment. And so I knew I needed to start finding some new ways to respond to the environment. So this was actually a mushroom, kind of at the tail end of this exploration. So just to give you a sense of scale, if you haven't been to the show at VCP, this was an image from the Lost Garden shown at the Alexander Heath Contemporary Gallery in Roanoke this past December. So these are the kind of the scale of those digitally printed 4x5 negatives and some of the contact printed smaller negatives, and actually the squirrels are back here. So moving forward, right, after kind of working on this particular series for so long, in the summer of 2022, I began like really reassessing my practice and my life here in Virginia. And truly it had been a very extraordinary several years, right? I relocated to the South at the height of the pandemic. You know, I'm a lifelong New Englander, so this was a huge adjustment culturally and weather-wise in every way. And anyone who's here who might be an educator knows that teaching during the pandemic was very difficult, and integrating into a new community felt like kind of impossible. You know, at the same time, I had lost two very close people in my life to cancer, and things just felt like everything is changing, right? And what do I need in this kind of new juncture, both personally and within my practice? So flowers, and we all need flowers in those moments. So as that summer began, I was really kind of in search of beauty, right? And rest and like connecting to this new place where I was living. And so I just looked out my front door. I live in an old Victorian in an urban neighborhood, and just witnessed the moment, like that exact moment that the roses kind of released and fell to the ground. And it just really moved me. It was very beautiful, right? This letting go, this like moment of release, the colors. So I took this image with my film camera, and then decided to, make some cameraless work with flowers, right? And there are so many incredible flowers here in Southwest Virginia. Things bloom from February to October. It's pretty amazing. So this was the image that I made that day. Kind of coming back to color film, like I think I wanted that like exuberance, right? I wanted more of that at this juncture. So again, these dye layers in the film are moving around, creating this sort of unexpected palette. Got lucky here that it was more rose-like. Sort of gave me also the motivation to keep an eye out for new and interesting flowers in the area. So, you know, it was fun. You know, this is a tulip poplar. Tulip poplars blew my mind when I moved to Virginia. They are a native tree that actually, their flowers are these like beautiful cupped tulips on the tree, and they're bright yellow. Oops, excuse me, whoops. This is flowers from a southern catalpa, another native tree in this region. And then finally, I got very obsessed with the Rose of Sharon. They're all over the city, and we have one kind of at our front porch, and they're just so beautiful. They're lush, they're pink, it's juicy. This palette felt vibrant and exciting, and so I started like continually exposing the Rose of Sharon to kind of see which colors I would get. You know, I was playing with different kinds of process, different kinds of chemicals to see what would happen. The second one. And the last one. So this is where I'm going to mostly leave off tonight. I'm still kind of working on that. I've also been doing some cameraless work on the coast of South Carolina at Edisto Island, and working on some new pinhole photography there as well, thinking about the idea of the land's memory, which is very poignant here in the South. So that's what I'm kind of grappling with right now. So again, I really appreciate your time tonight and sitting and doing this on a beautiful summer evening. This is my contact information if you want to reach out. So again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's amazing how many different pockets you've managed to explore via the plants and animals in your immediate environment. I wanted to offer, so folks can either, at the bottom of your Zoom window, there should be a little button labeled Q&A. You can either manually type in a question and I can read it aloud and Mary can respond to the group. Or you can, there should be also a raise hand button at the bottom, and you can raise your hand and then I can unmute you and you can pose your question directly with your own voice if you wish, whichever you prefer. So by all means, if anyone has any questions or comments or theories of the universe to discuss with either of us. So Terrence, I believe, asked, The work is amazing. I have a technical question. Doesn't the film instantly overexpose when you're in this process, considering many of them are?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I get that question a lot. So of course it does, right? It's outdoors, but that's only if you develop it normally, right? So over time, I've kind of played with some different ways to treat the film. And a lot of what you see is kind of decay of film. And so no, you couldn't just develop it in Developer and expect kind of a normal result. So you kind of have to remove the idea of how film works, right, with this particular work. So yeah.
Mary gave me the secret that she doesn't reveal all of her technical secrets and encourages people to go about and set forth in your own experimental processes.
Well, and that's why I talk about that a little bit at the beginning of the talk, is that it's so much trial and error, right? And it's like, thank you, Terrence. And it's so much trial and error, and so much of the excitement is like finding the thing that happens and then kind of running with it yourself. And so in the cameraless photography class I teach at Hollins, my students by the end are always doing things I don't know how to do, right? Because they're kind of playing themselves with how this all works and seeing what happens.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions from the the audience? Terrence also said, they remind me of chemograms, which I suppose you could say in a way they maybe are a version of chemograms. But
maybe.
All chemistry interacting with chemistry of paper and silver emulsion. Jean said, thank you so much, Mary. I'm wondering how you feel about the difference between making contact prints and digital prints for exhibition. So as some of you may know, that there's actually half of the exhibit here at VCP are digital enlargements, and then half of them are darkroom prints. But Mary, did you have thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the great thing about the digital prints is that you see detail that you wouldn't normally see if you were making just a contact print, right? And so you're taking a small negative, you're printing it at 24 by 30, and so a lot of that detail you can kind of immerse yourself into. With the contact prints, I wanted more of that intimate experience, right? And of course, who doesn't love the quality of a nice silver gelatin print? So I love the kind of methodical way of making a small print edition in the darkroom. Like I love being in the darkroom, but I also continue to scan and print digitally just so I can get that scale that I find interesting.
And I think 20 by 30-inch sheet film, or whatever size those larger prints are, exorbitantly expensive, perhaps. Yeah. Jean said, gotcha. Right. Any other questions or comments that people have about either for inspiration or background or what's next? She sort of led us into that with her last batch of things that she shared in the slideshow. But Max Wexler says, thank you for sharing at VCP. We love him. We love him. And Linda says, thank you for this journey through your process. I love how you started by letting us know that trial and error is key to the practice, accepting that we can make mistakes allows us to really explore.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think photographers, we can get really caught up in perfection, right? It's like getting it right, getting exposure right, getting the darkroom print right, getting everything right? And it's there's something about this kind of process that allows you to let go of that. You know, when I learned photography, I was at New England School of Photography in Boston. I learned on a 4x5 camera. It was zone system. It was like, how do you get the most perfect negative ever, right? That you then scan and print in the darkroom, and that's perfect. And I love that kind of work. It's beautiful. But this sort of blows that up in a way that I find interesting. It's like you want the mark making on the film. You want the emulsion to crack. Right? It's kind of the opposite.
Relinquishing control.
Yeah.
Yield wild and beautiful results that we would have never been able to accomplish in trying to restrictively control every factor. So,
And of course, for every one you see, I think it's also important to note that there are so many that don't work out, right? It's not like I go outside and everything is magic, right? There's a lot of things that don't work out.
we want to see all your test prints.
Mhm.
Show us everything. The whole pie.
Whole pot.
All right, who else? Who else has got something for us here? See you on there, Mom. You hanging out. She's probably got her beagle in her background as well. Does Chuck have any questions that Chuck would like to? Dolores,
Talking about the series, he's like, I know what you do, and
Dolores
I'm
said,
snoring a little bit right now. So he was a good boy during this talk.
Dolores said, loved it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Jean said, some days everything is magic and other days nothing is.
So true.
Part of the serendipity, ethereal nature of the alternative processes, especially when the alternative processes involve elements of nature and environment and things descending from the heavens that we have no otherwise control over. But
I definitely had things that were on film snatched by other wildlife in the night. That was one way things, got interesting.
almost be an opportunity to, well, it could be a multimedia installation where you have like a time lapse, like night vision game cam placed over your piece being created while it's being created, and then you can document nature's interaction with the piece while it's being made.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
All right, any last fleeting thoughts and questions? Thank you, guys. You can either type message into the Q&A or the chat down below, or you can click raise hand and I will unmute you and you can ask your question with your own voice. Jean said, thank you so much. What a treat to see these works in person, Mary.
Thank you.
I was just here the other day. So thank you, Jean. We appreciate you. And we appreciate Bonnie and Dolores and Jackie and Jean and Linda and Steve and Taffy and Terrence and Max and all the people. So thank you, everybody. If there's no last lingering questions, we'll wrap it up. But this, for posterity reasons, I shall inform you that this evening's talk has been recorded and will be shared on VCP's website. If you weren't able to join this evening or want to rehash. So thank you. And thank you, Mary. And don't forget that you have tomorrow, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to get down to the VCP and come in to see her show before it ends at 5 p.m. On Sunday. You can even come for open portfolio night Sunday evening. Or even better, come to Putney from 3 to 5 for the opening at Next Stage, and then come back to VCP from 5 to 7 for open portfolio night. And while you're here, you can also see Mary's show, and then come back next Friday, the 1st, for gallery walk and the opening of 2 new exhibits. But regardless,
VCP for all the things.
All the things, cameras,
things.
darkrooms, galleries, shenanigans. But thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. And thank you, Mary.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invite, and it's been great. So thanks, everybody.
Linda said, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Linda. Have a great night, everybody. See you later.